early hours of October 29, 1955, a Soviet battleship lay quietly at anchor in Sevastopol harbor. Her engines were cold, her decks were dark, and most of her crew slept deep below the waterline. She had survived 2 world wars, outlived the empire that built her, and crossed from fascist Italy into the heart of the Soviet Navy. Before dawn, she would kill more sailors than any other peacetime naval disaster in Soviet history. Giulio Cesare had been conceived in a different era, laid down before the First World War at a time when battleships were still experimental giants, built on the belief that naval power would always be decided by gunfire at sea. Armed with 13 12-inch guns, 577 feet 5 inches, and over 25,000 tons, she was one of the most powerful warships in the world. When she entered service in 1914, she symbolized Italy's ambition to be counted among the great naval powers. Yet history denied her a defining moment. The First World War ended with Giulio Cesare largely untested, and the rapid pace of naval innovation soon rendered her obsolete. By the 1920s, ships like her were already considered relics of an earlier age, and many navies chose to scrap them outright. Italy chose instead to rebuild. In the 1930s, Mussolini's regime ordered a radical reconstruction of its aging battleships, tearing Giulio Cesare down almost to her hull and rebuilding her from the inside out. Her engines were replaced, her armor reworked, her guns modernized, and her speed significantly increased. When she emerged from the shipyard, she looked familiar but was fundamentally different, a new ship concealed within an old one. The rebuild was as political as it was technical, intended to project strength and modernity at a time when symbolism mattered as much as firepower. When the Second World War erupted, Giulio Cesare returned to service in the Mediterranean. She fought at the Battle of Calabria in July 1940, exchanging fire with British battleships at extreme range and surviving a famous long-distance hit. Yet survival, rather than dominance, became her defining trait. As the war progressed, air power and submarines proved far more decisive than battleships, and fuel shortages limited Italian naval operations. By 1942, Giulio Cesare had been relegated to training duties. She was not defeated in battle, she was simply overtaken by history. Italy's surrender in 1943 left Giulio Cesare afloat, intact, and increasingly irrelevant. After the war, surviving Italian warships were divided among the victors as reparations, and Giulio Cesare was assigned to the Soviet Union. The decision was deeply unpopular in Italy, where the ship represented national heritage as much as military power. Rumors followed her departure, whispers of sabotage, of explosives hidden within her hull, of silent revenge for the humiliation of handing over a capital ship. In 1949, she arrived in the Black Sea and was renamed Novorossiysk. To the Soviet Navy, Novorossiysk was a contradiction. She was massive but outdated, powerful yet increasingly obsolete in an age rapidly moving toward missiles and submarines. Still, she served as a flagship and training vessel, a floating symbol of victory over fascism. Anchored frequently at Sevastopol, the heart of Soviet Black Sea naval power, she housed a crew living inside a ship designed before their fathers were born. In the early hours of October 29, 1955, the Soviet battleship Novorossiysk lay at anchor in Sevastopol harbor, secured bow first to a buoy in a roadstead used regularly by major warships. Her engines were shut down, internal systems were in night mode, and most of her crew, over 1,200 men, were asleep in forward compartments. At 1:31 a.m., a massive underwater explosion erupted directly beneath the forward hull, slightly to starboard of the bow. The blast tore a gaping hole in the ship's bottom plating, forcing steel inward with tremendous violence and instantly flooding several forward compartments. The explosion was not internal, it came from outside the hull, from below the ship, and its force was immense. Later estimates placed it equivalent to roughly 1,000 kilograms of TNT. The immediate effects were catastrophic. Forward magazines and living spaces flooded within seconds, trapping sailors in their bunks. Electrical power failed in parts of the ship, plunging compartments into darkness as water surged through passageways. Survivors described a violent upward jolt, followed by a deep, grinding shudder as the hull absorbed the blast. Damage control teams rushed to respond, but the scale and location of the damage made containment nearly impossible. The bow continued to settle, and the ship developed a growing list as water spread asymmetrically through the hull. Critically, command decisions in the hours that followed worsened the situation. Rather than immediately beaching the ship in shallow water, a measure that might have prevented capsizing, senior officers hesitated, uncertain whether a second explosion might occur or whether the damage could be stabilized at anchor. Counter-flooding orders were delayed and poorly coordinated, increasing the list rather than correcting it. As time passed, the ship's stability margin vanished. Just after dawn, more than 2 hours after the initial explosion, Novorossiysk rolled over and capsized, trapping hundreds of sailors inside the inverted hull. Some survived for hours in air pockets, hammering on steel bulkheads until the sounds faded. Official figures later placed the death toll at 617, though some estimates suggest it may have been higher. The Soviet Navy moved quickly to explain the disaster. The official conclusion was that Novorossiysk had detonated a leftover German magnetic bottom mine from World War II, one that had remained dormant on the seabed for a decade before finally being triggered by the battleship's magnetic signature. On the surface, the explanation appeared plausible. German forces had mined Soviet ports extensively during the war, and magnetic mines were known to have delayed activation and anti-sweep features. Subsequent minesweeping operations reportedly found additional German mines in the area, reinforcing the official narrative. Yet almost immediately, serious doubts emerged. Sevastopol harbor had been in continuous use since the war, not only by Soviet vessels but by salvage ships, tugs, and other battleships. Novorossiysk herself had anchored in the same general area before without incident. Magnetic mines were designed with limited operational lifespans. Remaining active and perfectly positioned 10 years later strained credibility. Most troubling of all, the damage pattern did not match that of a randomly placed seabed mine. The blast appeared precisely centered under the bow, directly beneath a critical structural section, as if deliberately positioned rather than accidentally encountered. Alternative explanations began circulating within naval circles. One theory suggested negligence. A Soviet-laid defensive mine, forgotten or improperly charted, detonated beneath the ship. This would still account for an external explosion, while avoiding the technical problems of a decade-old German device. However, this explanation raised uncomfortable questions about Soviet harbor safety practices and was never officially endorsed. Another theory proposed an internal explosion, perhaps ammunition or fuel, but forensic analysis during salvage argued strongly against it. The hull plating was bent inward, not outward, and no evidence suggested a magazine detonation. The explosion originated outside the ship, below the waterline, leaving internal causes largely unsupported by physical evidence. The most controversial explanation was sabotage. Persistent rumors claimed that Italian combat divers, veterans of elite frogman units from World War II, had infiltrated Sevastopol harbor and placed an explosive charge beneath the ship in revenge for the transfer of an Italian battleship to the Soviet Union. The story had undeniable dramatic appeal and fit neatly into Cold War paranoia. However, the practical realities make this scenario extremely unlikely. Sevastopol was one of the most heavily guarded naval bases in the Soviet Union, with layered defenses, patrols, and surveillance. Any foreign covert operation on that scale would have risked detection, diplomatic crisis, and potential war. No credible evidence, no intercepted communications, no confessions, no material proof has ever surfaced to support the sabotage claim. As the wreck was raised and examined, attention returned to the physical facts. The explosion was external, extremely powerful, and precisely located beneath a bow. It occurred at anchor, not underway, and produced no warning indicators typical of accidental mine activation. Taken together, these details increasingly pointed away from exotic explanations and toward a simpler, if politically uncomfortable, conclusion. Novorossiysk was most likely destroyed by a large bottom mine, probably German, possibly Soviet, that remained undetected due to incomplete post-war clearance and detonated under uniquely unlucky conditions. Whether the mine had been shifted by currents, disturbed by prior activity, or triggered by a rare convergence of magnetic and pressure effects remains unknown. In the end, certainty proved impossible. The Soviet Navy raised the wreck, recovered ammunition, and dismantled the hull, but the full investigative record was never made public. What is clear is that the disaster had profound consequences. Senior commanders were blamed and removed, confidence in battleships collapsed, and the sinking accelerated the Soviet shift away from big gun warships towards submarines and missile forces. Novorossiysk became not just a tragedy, but a symbol of an era ending violently and without warning. Giulio Cesare survived 2 world wars, reconstruction, surrender, and transfer between ideologies. She outlived the strategic concepts that created her, but she did not die in combat. She died at anchor, in peacetime, in one of the most secure naval bases on Earth, leaving behind hundreds of dead sailors and a mystery that, even now, has never been fully laid to rest.